you can start recording. Welcome everybody to this free webinar of the Think Tanks School. We are very lucky today to have Kerry Albright from UNICEF, from the Innocenti Center in Florence. Kerry is one of those rare individuals who has been working in the field of evidence-informed policy for a very long time in different organizations, and still going at it. So not tired of it. She's going to be talking to us about this very subject, how to mobilize evidence, in the context of her work at UNICEF. In previous webinars, we have been discussing the relationship of funders with think tanks. We've talked about how think tanks can be more strategic in different aspects of their work. But in this case, I think we're going to be looking a little bit more at the context in which think tanks are working. So, as always, these sessions are organized in the following way. Kerry will present briefly, and then all of you online right now will have a chance to ask her questions. The webinar will last about 45 minutes with about 20-25-minute presentation from Kerry. And if you want to ask a question, please use the chat box that you have on your screen, and I will pass on those questions to Kerry when she's done. If there's no time to answer all the questions, of course we can follow this online, either directly with Kerry or on our social media. We'll make this available. All right, so thank you very much, Kerry. Over to you.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Kike, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to talk to you today, and greetings to everyone who's listening from a very hot and humid Florence. I'm just going to switch to the presentation, so Kike, just maybe let me know if you can see it. Is that appearing?
Yes, that's perfect.
Fantastic. Okay. So, I mean, I don't know how many people who are listening actually know about the Office of Research Innocenti. We're, I guess, a quick and easy way of saying it is that we're UNICEF's de facto kind of in-house think tank, I guess. We're lucky enough to be supported by the Italian government based in Florence, Italy. And we have had some level of core funding from the Italian government for the last 30 years or so, so quite a unique position. And the work of the centre really kind of focuses around three main areas. Obviously, we do a lot of research on child rights. Another key area is really about sort of strengthening the capacity of colleagues across the organisation to conduct both ethical and quality research. And then a third area that is kind of growing in strength at the moment is our convening and thought leadership work, where we're really trying to bring together big picture strategic thinkers around next generation questions affecting children. So what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is a very personal journey, I guess. So I've kind of, it's obviously not the official views of UNICEF, but I'm taking you back from kind of where I joined the organisation from DFID in 2015. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about, from my perspective, a kind of the story of how evidence has grown at UNICEF. So kind of crudely speaking, thinking about it as assets and liabilities. I mean, obviously everybody knows the brand of UNICEF. It has a global brand and reputation and a very powerful advocacy machine. People and kind of known around the world for the comms and advocacy work and campaigns that come out of UNICEF. It's a very big organization, so our programming budget for this current strategic plan over a 4-year period is around 20 billion. So that's pretty massive, which I hadn't really appreciated when I joined. But also the scale and the reach. So we have 190 offices around the world and almost 17,000 staff. So it's a big beast. But I think perhaps one of the most interesting things about UNICEF, and it kind of places us in a very lucky position, really, in comparison to maybe a lot of more traditional think tanks, is that we work really closely. Our operating model is working hand in fist with governments. So sometimes that's a blessing, maybe sometimes that's more difficult, but I think it does give us unique access and enables us to to influence, I think, a lot more than perhaps maybe other organizations can. And there were some really smart people and a lot of, willingness to experiment around evidence. But on the liability side, I think, we have a very humanitarian mindset. We were set up after the Second World War. And I think it's probably fair to say that we actually pride ourselves still on being doers rather than necessarily being thinkers. So that's always a bit of an issue. We're hugely decentralized. Every office is run as a sort of mini UNICEF, so that makes coordination around evidence quite difficult. And inevitably, like everywhere else, there are often silos, so you don't necessarily have sort of evidence or holistic evidence thinking. Sometimes people think more around thematic areas. Again, like everywhere else I've worked, sometimes the evidence doesn't always get taken up. There's a danger that maybe it could sit on shelves, and people are really busy, very time pressured, and don't really have time to actively seek out evidence. And then kind of at the central level, there's perhaps, maybe some investment lacking in areas like access to peer-reviewed journals, etc., that makes, incentives quite difficult sometimes to draw down upon evidence in our decision-making. And, we work in 4-year cycles, so obviously we think of short-term results linked to those strategic plan priorities, which means occasionally that kind of thinking about longer-term issues, especially in relation to capacity strengthening, etc., aren't always easy. I wanted to set this. That said, we in our current strategic plan, we do have evidence as a driver of change for children as a key change strategy or enabler. And we'll come back to this strategic plan setup in a minute. But I just wanted to mention that when I'm talking about evidence at UNICEF, we're divided into different functions across data, across research, across evaluation, and knowledge management, amongst many others. So I'm mostly going to be talking from the research perspective. Obviously, that's where I'm based, but I'm going to try and bring in a few examples from around the world, from the other side as well. So starting on the evidence journey, I've kind of divided it into 4 waves, really. So we were lucky enough, I think, when I first came here, that actually we've got a really strong history of quality evidence generation at Innocenti. Going back over the last 30 years or so, some pretty seminal reports have come out that were very influential, like, for example, Adjustment with a Human Face. But then another very well-known and long-running flagship product is the report card. And I think what we've kind of learned here from the report card is how to really make use of league tables to look at a particular issue that's affecting children in industrialized OECD countries, and through sort of league tables to basically get people to compare and contrast. Now, this may not work in all contexts around the world, but this naming and shaming type element has been really influential and always manages to get a lot of interest both from the press but also from policymakers. Another project that's been running here for quite a while is the Transfer Project, which looks at impact evaluations of unconditional cash transfers, mostly throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And obviously a lot of the things here are around pushing back on myths, which I think has also been really important. There are a lot of myths around cash transfers, including the fact that people will drink away the money, or it creates dependency, etc. But actually, not only is the evidence prove that isn't necessarily the case, but also I think this act of sort of myth busting has been incredibly influential in its own right. So much so that in the countries where we're working, we're seeing the discourse at government level changing from social protection as a cost to that of an investment, and governments indeed are actually putting in more and more of their own resources to scale up. And then another project I also wanted to highlight from here is really looking at our work on child rights in the digital age. So this, as I mentioned, is kind of trying to be ahead of thinking about evolving context, but also shows the importance of finding allies early on. So this really, I think a lot of the online work around children in the digital age initially started focusing on protection. And we were able to actually better balance that discourse to also think about how people should really be looking at the benefits of the internet from a participation point of view, from an equity point of view. And that discourse is now a lot more balanced in policy circles, in global literature, but also, I mean, more pragmatically linking up with a very well-known academic from the LSE. We were able to influence the Global Commission on Internet Governance. It wasn't really recognized that 1 in 3 internet users is a child, but they were very age blind in terms of regulations, completely different ways that children engage with the internet. And then my colleagues from our data analytics division, I mean, this again, our mix surveys, our multiple indicator cluster surveys have been running for 23 years, pretty much all over the world, 113 countries. And these are really about supporting governments in generating their own data around indicators. And increasingly in the SDGs, we're playing an even more important role with the government ownership of SDGs and helping them to actually collect their own data there. So the Mix 36 round is known as the SDG Baseline Round. And we're collecting information through those surveys on 33 different SDG indicators and 11 different goals, as you can see there. So 43% of all household survey-based indicators. And then UNICEF obviously has always had a role in sort of MDG, SDG monitoring. And so we are actually, of the 17 goals, 169 targets, 230 indicators, and UNICEF is the global leader on data for children. So it's the custodian of 10 global indicators and co-custodian for a further 7 indicators. So in this capacity, we're kind of supporting governments to really generate, analyze, and use data for these indicators for all of their citizens, helping governments to think about international standards, mechanisms for compilation and for verification of national data, and to support setting up national databases. And there was this well-known report that was produced last year, particularly looking at how we're doing on the SDGs from a child's perspective. So we had a good starting point, but there were pockets of excellence, but actually there were also quite, quite significant pockets of evidence being generated across the organization that maybe didn't have such high quality standards. So this slide, I don't really expect you to see in detail. It's quite horrific, but our starting point was really to think that actually we really had to think about enhancing internal capacity for evidence generation, communication and use, for evidence-informed policymaking internally, if we really wanted to have the sort of credibility that we wanted to be able to attain externally. So, a lot easier to start with sticks rather than carrots. We developed loads of policies, procedures, guidance around ethics, quality assurance, etc. And we also, started doing maybe some of your more traditional sort of communication briefs. So a lot of existing IRBs and ethical review boards, for example, didn't tend to focus either on social science very often, or if they did, they didn't necessarily have child rights expertise. So we started off with a big project working with Southern Cross University in Australia to actually develop a database and support service on ethical research involving children. We commissioned sort of briefs, etc., around understanding what RCTs and impact evaluations really were, the pros and cons, how to work with adolescents, etc. And then we also recognized that, we weren't going to turn people who weren't researchers into researchers overnight at UNICEF. That was unrealistic. But actually, it was really important, if we wanted to have that credibility in this space, that people would be intelligent commissioners of research and were also able to use evidence and use the research findings to inform our own decision-making for policies and programming. So we looked around and pretty much ended up in having to invent research management methods training from scratch, which has now been rolled out across several UNICEF offices around the world. And you can see from the modules that it kind of skips through how you think about research, quality assurance, ethics, how you write good terms of reference, a quick refresh on basic design and methods, but then more on the use side as well. So critical appraisal skills to be able to tell good evidence from bad, thinking about the importance of evidence synthesis, research uptake and impact in evidence-informed policymaking, and then knowledge management and lesson learning. And we felt that this sort of internal capacity building was really important, so that when we spoke about these sorts of issues externally, that we would have that credibility. So that was really the first wave. The second wave, I think, was focusing more around communication. So we'd been commissioning a lot of research, but we hadn't always really bothered to track, the impact, or to properly understand the impact of what happened because of it. We're quite lucky, unlike most think tanks, that we didn't always have to report to a donor on this. But we started commissioning some independent impact case studies and found some really interesting results, as much about the process of doing research and evidence-informed policymaking as the actual outputs. So we worked with Sarah Morton from the University of Edinburgh to have a look at our drivers of violence research, and found some really interesting things. We did a deep dive in Peru, actually. And we found that, a lot of the government were quite embarrassed by the data that had been collected from the national survey around the prevalence rates of violence against children, didn't believe it, highly sensitive, and had locked it away, and wanted to commission another survey. But the team actually managed to work with them to persuade them that they weren't alone in these particular high rates of violence against children. It was a universal phenomenon, including in many developed countries. And actually the minister in Peru became a sort of global champion for both the evidence around violence against children and advocating others to do similar surveys. So we managed to both unlock hidden data sets, but also to prevent wastes of money. And then, this led on to, again, new financing being released and a corporal punishment law being passed. So that was really interesting. But then again, on the communication side, we really recognized that, people just were so busy, they just weren't really finding the time to be able to draw upon evidence in their programming and policy making. So we thought we have to make this simpler for people. So we started a series of digests collecting the latest research around particular topics being generated globally. We had a big adolescence program funded by DFID at the time. And then we also started investing in evidence gap mapping, which, most people I think will know was a simple way of visually depicting evidence in a way that's really intuitive for policymakers to see at a glance. Another big thing that kind of took off across the organization was a global competition, actually, on best of UNICEF research. So we'd started now to think more about the carrots as well as the sticks to encourage use of evidence. And to try and reward those sort of lone people that were championing evidence across the organization. And there was also a slight self-interest element, wanting to be able to promote UNICEF as a thinker in the child rights space. So I just picked a couple of examples from the last 2 years to give you an example, to give you a bit of a feeling for what we were doing. So this is an interesting one. This project from last year was taking place in Brazil, which has really incredibly high rates of adolescent homicide. And the UNICEF country office there had been working with government officials to really try and unpack why that was happening. And I think what's interesting about this piece of research is, a frequent debate in think tank circles about whether or not the evidence speaks for itself, or whether you really need to be able to appeal to values through the power of storytelling. And this piece of research did exactly that. It collected evidence, but it really put it in young people's voices, used personal stories to actually be able to influence and to persuade the government about what was happening. And that was really influential. Again, it led to this special committee on the prevention of homicides being established. And it also led to an awful lot of press coverage and a nationwide campaign to actually take this issue seriously. And I've put some links in there if people are interested in that. The second example I really wanted to highlight was, again, one from last year, looking at comprehensive sexuality education in Thailand. Again, so despite the sort of nationwide system of CSE, massively high rates of adolescent pregnancy and HIV infection. So here the country office had worked with a local university and the ministry to try and find out, what was going on? Why, despite this sort of nationwide CSE campaign, were these, extremely high infection rates or pregnancy rates happening amongst young people? So this one used both quantitative and qualitative methods, but it really uncovered a fact that a lot of the teaching was being shared in a very negative way. So really about pregnancy prevention, rather than teaching things, softer skills, I guess, life skills around confidence, empowerment to be able to negotiate condom use, to critically evaluate options, etc. So the government completely changed its approach to rolling out this initiative, and focused a lot more on edutainment delivery methods, and set up a new steering committee for e-learning. And again, this is still relatively new over the last 2 or 3 years, but it's fed into improvements of the 2016 Teenage Pregnancy Prevention and Alleviation Act, and we're already starting to see differences there. So that's just a couple of examples of the sorts of research maybe that UNICEF is undertaking. And then our third wave is more recent. This is really thinking about how we can actually systematize use of evidence in decision-making, both across the organization and with our government partners. So I said that we'd kind of return to this strategic plan at the beginning. What we actually realized was that we really needed a higher level tool to try and map the emerging evidence against each of those high-level goal areas that you see highlighted in yellow. So we teamed up with the Campbell collaboration, and we produced a mega map, a sort of mega map of maps in terms of evidence generation. So this is really exciting for us. It not only sort of lays out the state of the global evidence in those 5 areas of the strategic plan, but really exciting, rather than being a one-off tool, it's a living map. We got funding from Gates to keep it updated over the lifetime of the strategic plan, so people can see the state of the evidence as it changes in real time as they start to think about designing new programs, which again was very exciting for us. Another thing that we've been doing is more on the softer side around organizational strengthening. I've mentioned several times that what we really wanted to do, if we wanted to be able to convince our government partners and use our relationship with them to use evidence more efficiently in their decision making, that we needed to have some credibility internally. So we copied a survey that had been undertaken by the World Bank and DFID, and an independent commission on aid impact review of how DFID learns, to produce our own survey last year, looking at staff's attitudes to and uses of evidence in our internal decision making around those areas that you can see in the diagram. We had over 2,000 people across the organization respond. And this has been very interesting. We're starting to unpack that now. We had a series of contextualized regional webinars, and we're working with INASP, who I'm sure several of you will know, and also Politics and Ideas, a think tank that again I'm sure several of you will know, to try and unpack the results of that survey in our South Asia and East Asia Pacific regions, to really do a deep dive, to work out what those regions are trying to do to embed a culture of evidence, and to come up with some quick wins to try and think about how we can improve an evidence culture in those regions. And that has kind of led us now where we're at a place where maybe we feel a bit more confident around thinking more about how we actually build up all our internal lesson learning, to think about how we do more externally with government partners to strengthen evidence ecosystems. And here I think this is where there's a really exciting opportunity to collaborate a lot more with think tanks in this space. So we're currently actually undertaking a scoping of trying to map potential research partners or data evaluation partners with a focus on southern think tanks, so that it's not always the international consultancy firms or universities that end up partnering with us. And we will be issuing a consultancy to help us look through those issues in more detail, and in the next couple of months. And I'm sure that there'll be people on the line who may be interested in helping us think through that. But other things that we've been doing are really, again, with Gates, we've been conducting some sort of deep dives around understanding the data landscape. So our colleagues in New York have got funds to really think about how we understand the actors, how they interact, where the power lies, etc., etc. And we also commissioned an Evidence for Children roundtable to try and get think tanks, emerging thinkers from the global south, to debate, what this sort of evidence architecture might look like. Again, another sort of system strengthening type initiative where we've been working with Hewlett to think around how we strengthen systems for data access in the education area. So here, colleagues in our program division have really tried to think about how they can unlock data, not generate new data, but look at all the existing data sets, how we can open them up and make them more transparent, how we can empower communities to look at that data and make comparative decisions through things like scorecards, etc., to make their own decisions about their own kids' schooling, supporting the government to actually make better resource allocation decisions so that the optimal investments are in the right parts of the country, and then trying to learn from that, doing knowledge management and accountability, including an independent evaluation about whether or not this is working. And again, our thinking now is building upon our earlier organizational learning activities to think about how we can do more around breaking down those silos. What does it actually mean really to do system strengthening, to do implementation research, so that research isn't conducted in isolation but feeds into our programming? Thinking a lot more about the politics of evidence and the power dynamics. So we're starting to look really at things like behavioral insights and whether or not insights from that level of expertise can help us to enhance use of evidence in our programming and in our advocacy work. And again, maybe of interest to people listening, we'll be advertising a role in that space in a few months' time. And then that kind of led to us feeding into sort of global discussions around advancing the evidence-informed policy-making space. So some of you who were there at the On Think Tanks conference in Geneva earlier this year will have heard me report back a little bit about the Hewlett Foundation convened meeting in Bellagio, where the people that were in the room came up with sort of 4 ideas there to advance the evidence-informed policy-making field, including the need to better conceptualize it. Everybody talks about it, we don't actually know what it means. It's quite hard to think about it beyond sectors. To think more about how we actually engage communities in decision-making and use the power of things like March for Science, etc., to get governments, to force governments to make better use of evidence in their own decision-making processes. There was some pushback on this idea, with people thinking that that maybe made politicization of evidence was quite dangerous. The third area was really thinking about how we actually institutionalize evidence. So some people may have seen some of the work that Sense About Science has been doing with trying to get governments to show their workings in terms of using evidence in their decision making. So to try and think, what more could we do there and get citizens to hold governments to account for actually using that evidence. And then the fourth area was looking at really the success of the open government partnership model with a multinational platform where governments could sign up or commit to, in that case, being more open in both involving citizens and sharing data. But in our case, maybe sign up and make commitments to using evidence in their decision-making processes, and whether we could maybe learn from that. So these conversations are ongoing. Hewlett is thinking more about what it wants to do in this space, but it's also trying to identify allies around the world who might help to work with them to really strengthen the field. And then the last wave I really wanted to talk about, I think is really interesting, and this is kind of what we've been seeing in the last year or so, around sort of enhancing youth voices in evidence processes. I hope none of these ladies actually require any introduction, but obviously Greta Thunberg, very well known for advocating on climate change, actually standing up and saying she shouldn't have to be doing this if adults were doing their job properly. Emma Gonzales, who's been campaigning against or campaigning for gun control in the US, and maybe slightly less known, but a UNICEF ambassador, Mozoon Aminan, who's really been, some people call her the Malala of Syria, which is maybe a bit unfair, but campaigning for education very successfully, educational access in her own right. And our communications division, based out of New York, has actually set up a whole new team around this, thinking about how we better engage young people now. And that we're really seeing a complete shift in attitudes. Rather than thinking about conducting research on young people or tokenistic participation with young people, it's a complete mindset change about thinking how we engage with people. So not telling stories for them, but young people telling their own stories. From representing young people's opinions to actually facilitating young people to speak up for themselves. To engaging not just a privileged set of young people, but to try and engage a whole broad spectrum. So there's a lot of work going on across our organisation now, working with external think tanks and others to think about how we could actually enhance this. So this new team set up in the Division of Communications is really thinking through those different areas that I talked about. So how we can create meaningful opportunities for young people to take action in their own right, how we can facilitate platforms and tools and resources so that they can showcase their own opinions. And then thirdly, thinking around how we can build capacity of our own staff to actually engage more systematically and more on an equal basis with young people. So these are the 4 work streams. I've put some, if we share the presentation afterwards, I've put some links at the bottom to show the sorts of things that are going on around this space now. And I think there's tremendous opportunity to engage with think tanks here. And from our side at Innocenti, we're also thinking through these issues. So in October later this year, we have an inaugural Leading Minds conference looking at the topic of mental health. 30 leading minds from around the world, not just the usual luminaries, but also young change makers will be attending. And the purpose of that really is not just to have a conference, but to really co-create an agenda for moving these sorts of issues forward with resources allocated to it, dedicated plans, and fellowships for young people who are change makers, who are dynamic individuals in their own communities, to come and to influence us, to help us actually set the evidence agenda with questions that are defined by the next generation. And similarly, the same sort of thing, we're having a film festival here for the first time in Florence later in October, not something we've ever done before, celebrating our 30th anniversary of being here in Florence, being hosted at Innocenti, and the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And here again, getting young people from around the world, as well as other filmmakers, to submit short films on issues that matter to them, so that we can really get those opinions fed into helping to set our evidence agenda and our research agenda here at Innocenti and across UNICEF. So my final slide really, I've cantered through quite a lot of content, but I just wanted to say that I think, we're not perfect, it's still a journey, we've still got a very long way to go, but we are trying increasingly to use evidence for social change, both influencing our own internal processes, our policies and programs and advocacy work, but also our partners, and particularly the governments around the world with whom we work so closely, to make better use of evidence as a real and genuine driver of change for children in the ways that you see there on that slide. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't take too long, Kike. Do have a look at our website, sign up, get some alerts. There's always very exciting stuff coming out of this place. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Kerry. I don't know if you want to go back to...
I will stop sharing. Just give me a second. There we go.
Great. There's a couple of questions here. Let me go first with P. Taylor. I don't know if that's Peter Taylor or not, but it's great you highlight citizen engagement as more central to evidence-informed policymaking. Yes, it is Peter Taylor. Hi, Peter.
Hi,
From
Peter.
Your experience at UNICEF, to what extent is evidence generated by citizens really valued in comparison with evidence generated by more traditional academic researchers? Within UNICEF and its partners, are citizens now being seen as co-creators and generators of evidence in addition to being simply evidence users or advocates? And I think this is a very pertinent issue. I remember working with UNICEF for a very long time, and UNICEF has always advocated for giving children a voice, a seat at the table and a voice. And they're not always going to say what the evidence suggests.
Nope.
And not even that. Children might not have a say, but their parents will, and their parents might might present evidence that is heavily influenced by emotion. So how do you balance those two out? Is it evidence from the RCT will always trump evidence from the citizen?
I mean, that's a really hard question because, I mean, we're, as I said, with 190 semi-autonomous offices, obviously different offices around the world look at this question in different ways. I mean, if I'm frank, I think we have genuinely struggled with how to make participation, particularly by young people, more than tokenistic. I think that's not a challenge that's unique to UNICEF. We've always been pretty good at actually consulting beyond academics, really, so consulting parents and teachers, etc., as well as children in a lot of the evidence generation activities that we do. But as I kind of mentioned in my last few slides, I really think that we're seeing a complete step change at the moment. A lot of adults have really been put in their place by very vocal, very articulate young people who are becoming change makers, who really are have got the ear of the press, are actually putting us in our place in terms of saying, this is not tokenistic participation. We have opinions and rights as our future, and we demand to be heard. And that's, to be honest, it's been quite a wake-up call. And I think this new division that has been set up to really tackle that is producing some really interesting stuff. And I think it's definitely going beyond tokenistic engagement. I think we've had some successes already. Some people may have heard of U-Report, where we actually try and get young people as citizen journalists to engage with us. But actually, I think we're going to be seeing a big step change in this space in the next few years.
So Dragan asks another question. So let's say UNICEF is a well-oiled machine in terms of generating and using evidence. But then you still have to convince policymakers. And policymakers are affected and driven by local politics. Yeah. So how do you go from evidence that you might generate, you might be comfortable with, you might turn into these various programs and initiatives to actual change on the ground, when inevitably the views, the opinions, the values of people are going to have a say?
I mean, again, that's not a surprising question. I think we all recognize that effect. I'd love to think UNICEF is a well-oiled machine in terms of using evidence. I wouldn't make that claim. As I said, I think we have a long way to go. I think we're trying to tackle it from all sorts of different angles, but our humanitarian origins do mean that people actually like getting on with stuff and not always sort of slowing down and considering the evidence, or also thinking that 20 years in the field experience matters as much as whatever an academic sitting in Florence or elsewhere is producing. But this is what I was saying. I mean, and I hadn't, to be honest, I hadn't really appreciated it before joining UNICEF myself. The power of the relationship between UNICEF and the government. We really do work so closely. So this is a little bit different. As I was saying, that I mean, maybe sets us apart possibly from think tanks, where part of the role is around challenging governments and actually, we work very closely with government partners. So we don't conduct research unless we work through our country offices. And our country offices' whole programs are set up in collaboration with governments. So there's a ready-built audience there straight away. The research issues are actually demanded by governments. So that really helps, getting stakeholders involved from the beginning. I mean, it's a classic kind of, research uptake type issue. We never have to worry about just, promoting something at the end, because people are engaged throughout that. That said, sometimes, we're a political organization. Sometimes some of our challenges, quite frankly, are around coming up with evidence that actually goes against government policies or positions. And again, I think through not springing the evidence on them as a surprise at the end, through working in collaboration throughout the process, co-creating throughout the process, really does help to actually instill that ownership and have a better chance of it being used. It doesn't mean that sometimes things aren't buried, frankly. That inevitably always happens, but or has a chance of happening. But actually, I think we have more successes than we might otherwise have through the closeness of that relationship.
Let me ask you another question, and I'd remind everybody who's online that they can keep asking questions to Kerry. You describe this close relationship between UNICEF and the government. That works, I think, with most UN agencies, with most sort of international organizations hosted, by a government. They have a close relationship, right? They're hosted by the Peruvian, the Malawian, the Kenyan government. And you generate research, or you generate evidence, you bring evidence from different sources, you develop your programs with government. And of course, there is always a temptation to say, well, government likes our idea, let's just work with them, let's get it implemented. But I feel that this risks leaving sort of local research communities, local NGOs kind of on the side, kind of as an audience of your success or of your policy influence, or even behind, because maybe they don't yet have the skills to do the kind of research that you're proposing to the government. Maybe they're not involved in that field that you're bringing in to that country from evidence you've gathered around the world. So you bring experts from around the world. So we see this happening not just with UNICEF, with many other international development agencies at the local level. So what do you think an agency like UNICEF, and particularly your part of UNICEF that deals with evidence, what can it do to make sure that local academia, local think tanks, local NGOs are not just audiences in this process of change, but participate actively?
Yeah. No, I hear you. I think that's a really genuine criticism, and I think it's something that we have to get much better at. I mean, nearly all of our research is conducted with local partners as well as with international partners, but at the same time, I think there's a lot more that can be done there. So this is where I was talking about the sort of the work that we're starting to think about now to discuss with others around building an evidence ecosystem, so that it's not always international experts parachuted in, but you are actually building, working with some really great local think tanks, building capacity and building structures and platforms where people can actually communicate and get together. So part of that is the mapping work that I've talked about, that we're just about to start doing. So looking at great directories on think tanks, the work of Think Tank Initiative and others, to really try and build upon that, to identify who those partners are that could really bring that local expertise and knowledge, recognizing increasingly that the politics of evidence is more and more important, and people parachuted in just don't get that context necessarily. So we're trying to sort of diversify our supply base. We're planning on producing this mapping, particularly to support our country offices to draw down upon strong skills and capacities within the region, people that can actually work around evidence for children, rather than always having to end up going to the big international consultancy firms. And it's something that we've been asked for a lot. I think to get it right is always a big challenge, because obviously, one person's endorsement, whether you endorse an organization or an individual, there are lots of sort of technical things to work through, but I think that's really important. So that's the kind of the partnerships mapping side. But on the other side, this idea of an ecosystem, I mean, I think we need to work harder even within UNICEF to try and bring together our data, our research and our evaluation investments in country, but to also use that convening power, if you like, and the power of the brand to build communities, to build platforms where we can bring together journalists and civil society and parliamentarians and think tanks to provide a space, in our case, where we can actually get people together to debate issues of evidence for children. And so we're looking at ways that we can actually build that sustainable infrastructure, trying to balance international evidence, local context, and a variety of skill sets.
Great, thank you. I want to ask one more question. Christina asks, is Innocenti working on developing guidance for participatory research with young people? There seems to be a lot of interest in this from youth civil society, but not a lot of know-how on it, particularly research that can be coordinated by traditionally non-researchers, youth workers, NGO workers, frontline workers, etc. Which would, I guess, go quite a long way in helping non-researchers have evidence that they can bring to the table.
Yeah, so we produced a series of methodological briefs again last year on conducting research with adolescents, which got some experts around the world who regularly work with adolescents to share some of their best practice lessons. which was pretty successful. But then, and we worked with the Lancet Commission, we worked with Columbia University and others on that. But we also had some feedback from actually a really interesting group of PhD students based out of Oxford University who said, they were quite quantitative methods. You need a lot more around ethnography, participatory methodologies. Young people conducting research themselves sometimes gets insight that more experienced academics can't. So we're working on this new series now, which again, we hope is going to come out in a month or so. So look at the website, watch this space, and I'm almost certain that there will be tools and processes coming out of the adolescent engagement team in New York as well on this issue.
Great. Thank you very much, Kerry. I want to keep this to time. And I'm sure if there are any more questions about this. Somebody asked about the evidence maps, but they have been shared on the chat box. And if there's anything else, Kerry, that you want to share, we'll be sending out an email to everybody who signed up with information about where to watch this video again, and this link and others to them as well. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you everybody for joining us online. This has been recorded, so you'll get to watch it soon. We'll be sending it out to you, and then of course you can please do share it with your colleagues or others who might be interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, and hope to work with many of you in coming years. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Kerry.